Okay. How's everybody's Sunday going? Are we off to a good vach? Are we off to a good week? Are we off to a Shavua Tov? And if we're not off to one, can we make it into a good week? That's what we're looking for right now. How are you, my holy brothers and sisters? It's good to be with you. Hello, Josh Diaz checking in, and Dory Cohen. Some new names. This is great. Where are people tuning in from? What country, what city, what continent? We love to hear. Josh is in from New York. I grew up in New York. Our hearts go out to New York. It's really, it feels like it's such a hot spot in New York with the pandemic, and really people there have it just tougher than everywhere else, and we're praying for you that we should only hear good news, flatten out the curve, round it off, get on the other side, and just hear good news about people healing and getting past this thing. Okay, we had a nice session today, our first Accidental Talmudist Zoom forum. I had a bunch of people show up, and it was nice, and we heard some really beautiful stories about just what a diverse community we have. You know, we had people from as far away as Johannesburg, South Africa on our Zoom call, and Amsterdam and Israel, lots of places around the United States. Orthodox Jewish, Reformed Jewish, secular Jewish, Christian, just lots of different traditions, different faith journeys. And it was a really beautiful time to be together. So we look forward to doing that again. And so watch out for that. We'll send out that email. And when it comes, be part of it. I think you'll enjoy it. It was a good time. All right, so here we are on here in AT Daily. We're making our journey through the Daf Yomi cycle. We're in the second tractate of the Talmud, Shabbos. And today we're finishing chapter 4. So it's a very short chapter, just 4 little Mishnahs. And we're going to finish up the 4th Mishnah of chapter 4 and begin chapter 5. It's hard for me to focus on the comments as I'm teaching. But I will always come back at the end of the class. So if you've got questions or comments, definitely log them there. And so just before I sort of stop paying attention, let me look one more time. Ed Berg is in the house from New Jersey. Donna Smith, always great to see you, North Carolina. Bonnie Robb from San Clemente says, we love you, Bonnie. It's great to have you here. James Roth, always a great name to have in the community. We love you, James, in Indianapolis. Timothy says shalom from Central Arizona. Okay, so we're finishing up chapter 4 today of Tractate Shabbos. So this 4th Mishnah teaches 2 basic ideas. The first, if you did not insulate the cooking pot on Erev Shabbos, so on Friday afternoon before Shabbos began, you can't insulate it after Shabbos begins, right? So we understand, the whole thing is we don't want to kindle fire or extinguish fire. We don't want to cook, which is one of the prohibited labors, on Shabbos. Insulating, we know we can do, and as we've discussed earlier in chapter 4, we can insulate a pot that's already hot, but there's certain materials that we may not use because they have inert sort of chemical processes, whether it's fermentation or creating new compounds through a mixture with moisture. And so we don't use those materials because they don't just retain the heat that's already there, they add heat. And likewise, so what would be the problem if we were using the permitted materials that don't add heat but just retain heat? What would be the problem of adding that insulation material after Shabbos began, assuming, of course, from what we learned yesterday, that we designated those materials to be insulation materials, that they weren't otherwise muktzeh. So we'll come back around in our discussion today to find out why is it a problem to add insulation after Shabbos begins. The second idea that is in our Mishnah, this final Mishnah of chapter 4, is the question, may we insulate something that is cold to keep it cold. Up until now, we just assumed that the reason we were insulating something is because it was hot and we wanted to keep it hot. Now the question is, may we insulate something that is cold to keep it cold? And we're going to discuss that in a moment. Okay. So what is the concern with insulating something that is cold? It seems odd, right? These days, okay, there might be a problem that the refrigerator, if it has a refrigerator light and you open the door and it turns on the light, that is actually a Shabbos violation. And thank God most modern refrigerators actually have a Shabbat setting where you can press this button and then the light won't go on and off, or you can unscrew the bulb, something like that. So it's nothing like that. The issue with insulating something cold so that it stays cold is it's actually unclear. The way the Mishnah puts it is may we insulate something that is cold, right? So you might be saying two different things. One is you're taking something that's cold and you're going to add one of those materials to it that actually add heat, right? So one of those materials that are forbidden to add to something that is hot because it will add heat. And so we learned like manure has an sort of internal fermentation going on, or the residue of an olive press. If you take all that material, it actually generates heat inside. So may we put something that is cold inside one of those substances, not so that it stays cold, but so that it would actually warm up? Answer, no. Those substances that are prohibited to insulate hot food because they will add heat to it, we may not put them around something that is cold to, sort of bring it to room temperature. That's not something that we can do according to this halakha. But in terms of something that is cold and we want to keep it cold, there was some disagreement among the sages, and there was even disagreement between Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, known as Rebbe, and himself. At one time, he issued a ruling that we may not take something cold and insulate it to keep it cold. And then later, he issued a ruling that we may insulate something cold in order to keep it cold. So we wonder, what happened? Why did Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi change his mind? And let's just read it here. Wasn't it taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi permitted cold food to be insulated on Shabbat? The Gemara answers, this is not difficult. The statement was made before he heard the ruling of Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei. That statement in the Baraita was made after he heard it, as in that incident where Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi sat and said, it is prohibited to insulate cold food on Shabbos to keep it cold. But Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosei, said before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Father permitted insulating cold food on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, I retract my previous statement. As the elder, meaning Rabbi Yosei, had already issued a ruling on this topic, and I defer to his ruling. Now, what's interesting about this is that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the Nasi. He was the head of the Sanhedrin, basically the chief rabbi in Israel, and one of the most important rabbis in the history of Judaism, because it was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi who supervised the compilation of the Mishnah, which was completed around the year 200. So he was such a prominent guy, one of the most learned rabbis we've ever had, and capable of synthesizing all this information so that it would become the Mishnah, and a person who took action when it was necessary, right? Because there was fear that all these teachings would be lost due to Roman persecution. And so he made sure that they were set down, even in the very dense, brief, and coded way of the Mishnah. So if Rabbi Yehuda Nasi sort of analyzed the question, shall we permit insulating a cold, container on Shabbos to keep it cold, why would he change his mind just because some other sage had a different ruling? We've seen many times that different sages will come out in a different place on the same question. Why did the most prominent rabbi in Israel defer to somebody who was not even alive, right? He deferred to a ruling of Rabbi Yosef, but Rabbi Yosef wasn't alive anymore. It was a ruling of Rabbi Yosef reported to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in front of the Sanhedrin, in front of sort of the board of rabbis, if you will, by Rabbi Yosef's son, Rabbi Yishmael. And the answer is, well, let's back up a step. First of all, would Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, no matter what feelings he had about Rabbi Yishmael and about his father, Rabbi Yosef, would he have retracted his ruling if he felt that going with the opposite view from his own would lead people to sin in Israel? I'm sure that he would not, right? So, I mean, it's like he's willing to sort of be bipartisan, right, and take on the view of his disputant as long as it doesn't lead the people into sin. So what Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is basically saying here is, look, these kinds of rabbinic decrees, what is their purpose? They're policy, they're matters of policy, so that we protect the population from coming to violate a Torah prohibition. Just about every rabbinic decree, its purpose is to help people steer clear of coming into those difficult situations where they could predictably come to sin and violate a Torah prohibition. So what they're really disagreeing about is sort of how best to protect the people, how best to achieve the policy goal of keeping people within the fence of Torah, right? So in this case, basically what he was saying is, well, we need this ruling to protect people from, because they're going to insulate cold things to keep them cold, they might end up making a mistake in terms of insulating hot things to keep them hot in a way that's prohibited, and we want to protect them from that. But when he saw that one of his elders, and not just any elder, so Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi knew Rabbi Yosef and was his disciple when he was younger, right? So he just didn't know this particular ruling of Rabbi Yosef, and when he heard it, he was perfectly happy to retract his own ruling and be humble, right? How much would we like to see our politicians around the world, doesn't matter what country, doesn't matter what party, but how much would we like to see our politicians say, you know what, I've thought about this, I was wrong, you're right, right? I mean, we just don't see that very often, and it would be so much better if we did. It's funny, I'm a film director, and there was a great teaching we received from our directing the actor teacher, Delia Salvi, when I was at UCLA Film School. And she would say, it is amazing how much trust you earn from an actor. And actors are just like the most skittish, emotional people. They're very needy, insecure people because they deal with so much rejection. It just goes, it's par for the course if you're gonna work at being an actor in Hollywood. And so they're nervous people. But if you, as a director, collaborate with them, and sort of experiment together to try to find the character, that you're, jointly creating, that the actor's going to act out, but that the director's giving the feedback. And when you see that something isn't working, you say, you know what, I'm glad we tried that, but I was wrong. That you just earn so much trust from the actor. You don't weaken your position as a director, you strengthen it when you're willing to admit that something is not working. And I wish our politicians would do the same. And here, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was willing to back off, retract his ruling. And so Rav Papa comments on this. And Rav Papa is, another great Talmudic hero. Every time we finish a volume, we recount how great Rav Papa was, who raised 10 sons to all be sages. Right? Such a family that he was able to transmit not just his own love of Torah, but that high level love of Torah to all 10 of his sons. So Rav Papa says, come and see how much they loved each other. Had Rabbi Yosef still been alive, He would have been subordinate to and sitting before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi as his student, as Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, who took his father's place and was as great a Torah scholar as his father, was nevertheless subordinate to and sitting before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi as his student. And nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says the elder has already issued a ruling on this topic, and he deferred to Rabbi Yossi's ruling. It's just a great, great model of the kind of behavior we'd like to see in any kind of leadership, whether it's government or leadership of a corporation, of a school, whatever. This idea of deferring, and deferring properly, deferring respectfully, not saying, all right, fine, we'll do it your way. That is not properly deferring. The way that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, the elder has already issued a ruling, I will retract. That's the way to do it. Okay. Yeah, and I was reminded, I took a note on this. Okay, so there's a Shabbos lamp, right? So there are different kinds of Shabbos lamps. And kind of the most common one, we have one inside, but it's a lamp that allows you to reveal light and withhold light during Shabbos without turning on or off an electric light. Essentially what you're doing is the light doesn't move, but you rotate a shade around it, and because it's a cool, sort of modern, low heat bulb, it remains covered, and when you turn the shade, it's dark. It doesn't put out any light into the room. When you open it, it puts out light in the room. And I remember, and a lot of people have Shabbos lamps. They're very common and used by very, very religious Jews all over the world. And I remember once seeing an ad in a religious Jewish magazine for a competing product that worked in a different way. It had a different theory for how you can shade or unshade that light during Shabbos. And that's great. And the people who were sort of pitching that product were saying about the first product, the common one with the turning shade, instead of saying, we believe that this product poses a problem and here's why, they were using language that was strident. It's saying, this is an unkosher lamp, this is causing huge problems, and anyone who uses this is going to come to sin, and just very heavy-handed language. And obviously the people who created that first kosher lamp, Shabbos lamp, and all the people who use it, believe and receive rulings from, Gedolim, from big rabbis, that was a kosher lamp. So if you're going to challenge that and say there's a problem with it, so challenge the Torah and bring your sources. But that strident language, that they got it all wrong and they're leading everyone to sin, I just think is the wrong way to approach. That keeping a civil tone, especially when you're advocating for a different course of behavior, I think that civil tone is just crucial. And we just witnessed recently on a Facebook group, I'm not going to say the name of the group, the name of the rabbis, nothing, because I don't want to deal in Lashon Hara, but there was a Facebook group where somebody published a list of rabbis who, in their opinion, had issued rulings that were problematic. But they didn't say, this is the ruling that such and such rabbi gave that I think is problematic and here's why. They just said, this is a list of rabbis who are unkosher. I think that is terrible, terribly wrong. Right? You don't just issue insults, and it's a form of laziness, right? And it's a terrible form of Lashon Hara. Right? So if I make a mistake, great, absolutely. Please challenge me and say, accidental Talmudist made an error. This is what he said. This is why I think he's wrong. I will back off in a heartbeat. I may try to bring Torah to engage in the debate. I may try to take a question to somebody much more learned than me and make sure that I'm not leading people to sin. But what you don't do is say, hey, this jerk is an idiot and he said something terrible, and because he said that, you shouldn't listen to anything he said. Right? And I think it's just very important to learn from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi in the way that he dealt with Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Reb Yosef, in this issue. Enough said. There was another issue when Rav Nachman told his indentured servant named Daru to do two things: to insulate cold in order to keep cold, and as we see, that became permitted after Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi learned the ruling of Rabbi Yosef. And Rav Nachman also told Daru that he should bring water that was boiled by a Gentile on Friday afternoon. So for whatever reason, they didn't have hot water. Right? They didn't have hot water available, and they weren't going to be able to get some. Now, there had been a decree, and then what happened was, because it was known that Rav Nachman said to his slave, to his servant Daru, bring me this water boiled by a non-Jew on Friday afternoon, Rabbi Ami became angry. So someone asks, well, why was Rabbi Ami angry? The things that Rav Nachman said to Daru were both permitted. We know that it's permitted to insulate cold in order to keep it cold. And we know it's permitted to use water boiled by a non-Jew. Now, to understand the issue here, you have to understand that there was a time when at a certain point in our history, the sages decreed that a Torah observant Jew cannot eat food cooked by non-Jews. Why? Why did they do that? Was it because they were afraid that the non-Jews would put non-kosher food or non-kosher ingredients into the meal? No. There are certainly trustworthy people that you could go to, tell them this is how you want the food cooked, and it would be okay. What they were worried about was assimilation, right? In those communities at that time, those rabbis were very afraid that if the Jews came to, have meals with the non-Jews, which we saw at the time of the Hanukkah story, right? So much of Israel had become so assimilated that Torah had gone out of Israel. And to sort of combat that kind of dangerous assimilation, they said that Jews can't eat food cooked by non-Jews. But that decree, they didn't make it overbroad, right? So you couldn't eat food that had been cooked, meaning it was transformed from inedible to edible. But water, if you boil it, okay, that's technically cooking it, but you're not transforming it from something that's inedible into something edible. You're just boiling water. So it's permitted to have your water boiled by a non-Jew. So the question is, why was Rabbi Ami angry at what Rav Nachman did? Answer, because Rav Nachman is an important person. What was Rabbi Ami saying? He was saying that Rav Nachman, because he was an important person that everyone looks up to, needed to not only avoid impropriety, he needed to avoid the appearance of impropriety. He needed to avoid not only impropriety, but also the appearance of impropriety. The lesson, we hold our leaders to a higher standard. And if somebody could look at his behavior and think, oh, well, Rav Nachman is having something brought over from his non-Jewish neighbor, and he's eating it, I guess maybe they changed the rule. I don't have to worry about it. Rav Nachman did it, right? So you have to go a little bit out of your way, whatever rules you're following, to avoid the appearance of impropriety if you're a VIP, if you're an important person, a prominent person who does things in a visible way. Okay, and then back to complete the Mishnah, the first point was that we don't insulate food on Shabbat if it was not previously insulated before Shabbat, right? So the question is why? And the answer is because if we insulate it for the first time on Shabbos, we might make the mistake of heating the food up, right? Getting it a little bit hotter before we add the insulation, because that's the habit that we would have on Friday afternoon. Once we're thinking, okay, I'm going to insulate this, you want to get as hot as possible before you add the insulation, because that becomes a habit for people. If we allow them to add insulation for the first time on Shabbos, they might go through that same routine, sort of slip into their routine without thinking about it, and they'll add a little bit of heat first and then add that insulation. So we don't let them insulate for the first time on Shabbos, but if something was insulated before Shabbos began, then during Shabbos we could take the insulation off the cooking pot, serve out food, and then put the insulation back on the pot, as long as the item that's being used to insulate is not muktzah, as we discussed yesterday. Interestingly, you can insulate something that wasn't insulated before if you first transfer from the primary pot to the secondary pot, right? So you have an urn where you're boiling water, you take some water out of it and put it into a cup, or let's say a bowl. Now that's the secondary vessel. You can insulate the secondary vessel because now we're not concerned that you're going to add heat before you add the insulation, because you already went out of your way to make sure you weren't adding heat. You took it out of the primary pot and put it in a secondary pot. Why'd you do that? Because it's Shabbos. So clearly you remember that it's Shabbos. Clearly you remember that you can't, add insulation to the first pot. Since you moved it to the second pot, you've already removed, a certain amount of heat, and now you're just insulating in the secondary pot, so that is permitted. That is the conclusion of chapter 4 of Tractate Shabbos. And just to open our discussion of chapter 5, the first Mishnah, now we're going to be discussing, we're going to move on a little bit from cooking and from everything that we've been talking about, first carrying and in and out of domains, and then we went into cooking and insulation and the Shabbos lamp. And now in chapter 5, very much we're imagining the ancient world, we're going to talk about the animals. Right? The animals. People had donkeys, camels, horses, goats. So the question becomes, what kind of tackle, what kind of gear can you leave, let's say on your donkey or on your camel during Shabbos? Why are we asking that? Because you own your donkey. So you can't carry stuff on Shabbos from one domain to another, right? You can't transfer and you can't carry more than 4 cubits in the public domain. Therefore, neither can your animal. But some of the stuff that is the equipment of a beast of burden, right? There's a saddle, there's the reins, there's the bit in the animal's mouth. So can it carry those objects during Shabbos? Should the animal be stripped bare so that there's nothing, no human equipment placed on the animal? Well, the answer to that is no, because some of that equipment is necessary for the animal's safety and for the safety of other people in the community, right? If you took off the bit from its mouth that you used to lead the animal around, now suddenly, the animal gets spooked, gets scared, something goes wrong, it starts to move around, and it could become dangerous to other people. And now you don't have the reins to grab it, so it's a problem. You got to keep those things on the animal, not because it's carrying them in a form of burden, but because it's addressing the issue of security. So now the question becomes, okay, what do we actually need? Right? And what we're looking for is sort of the minimum, right? Because if you have a piece of equipment that doesn't help you, right, is insufficient to control the animal, like some kind of a bit on certain kinds of large animals where the bit is not enough and you actually need a nose ring, so then the bit should not be on the animal. Because if you can't use the bit for the sake of securing the animal, then the bit shouldn't be on the animal. On the other hand, maybe you have something that's excessive security. It's more than you need, right? Like a cat with a just a little string around its neck. That's all you need to control the cat, right? So you shouldn't put a heavy collar on the cat. That's excessive. Now we're going to see when we continue this tomorrow that if you're going to make an error, it's actually better to err on the side of excessive caution, because animals can be dangerous and can really harm people, rather than to err on having too little. You're going to err on the side of having a little bit too much. But we're still trying to understand, okay, what does each animal need so that it can be controlled safely and no more. And we'll continue with that tomorrow. I will now check the comments, see if there's any questions. Deirdre McQuaid is here in Hyattsville, just outside DC. Janice in Southern California. Joe is in the house. Joe Branson. Lindsay in Cincinnati. Bonnie in San Clemente. It's great, 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 great. Francis in Port St. Lucie, Florida. Robin in from Ohio. Judy from Anaheim. Jill Brown says, enjoying this very much. She's saying shalom from New Jersey. Sharon Frant Brooks says, if a non-Jew makes hot water for themselves, can a Jew use it as well? According to what we've learned here, yeah, absolutely, right? Absolutely. It doesn't have to be made for the Jew. You can. And Debbie Miller, I have a problem that you declare, let's see, Debbie Miller, I have a problem that you declare these minor transgressions of the law as sin. Judaism does not view how you shade on light on Shabbat as a sin. It is an interpretation of the law, not a sin. It gives the meaning of interpretation very different meaning than it was intended. The rabbis make a clear distinction between punishable sin and interpretation of the law. If you progress down this road, you become a very frightened creature versus an intelligent human. Well, the way the language is actually stated is if you violate a Torah prohibition, right, then you become liable to bring a sin offering. Doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that you violated a transgression. I think that the word sin probably has some baggage in it in our culture that maybe that's why you're objecting to it. We're not saying that this is a wicked or evil person, etc., right? The real language is liable or exempt, right? And then you can be liable or exempt for a sin offering for violating the Torah prohibition. And then there's a question of, did you violate the rabbinic prohibition that was designed to protect you from violating the Torah prohibition? We'll use the word sin for that, but it's really, are you liable to bring a sin offering or not? And what I think we really need to understand is that the offerings that we brought in ancient times, right? When we brought an offering to the temple, we did it because we committed a transgression. But the process of bringing an offering wasn't to make us suffer, to make us pay through the nose and give money to those priests down in the temple precinct. It was to help us go through a process to become purified, and then, to be able to enter the temple sort of free of that burden. We don't have the sacrificial system anymore, so instead we have prayer, right? It's prayer has taken the place of bringing the sacrifices. But it's the same thing, right? I mean, we're not talking here about the kind of sin that we normally think that's sinful, sinful, lustful thoughts or sinful, lustful actions, things like that. But the fact is, if we transgress Torah laws that we're obligated in, then then we've transgressed. We need to know that we transgressed. We need to know why we transgressed, and we need to come up with a plan of how we're going to avoid that transgression in the future. And so much of that includes praying for help. Hey, I violated this. I know I did wrong. I want to do better. Please help me do better, God. And going through that process brings us closer to God, closer to our community, and closer to the real mission of our soul. That's how I look at that. Okay. And Joe Branson says, what is a sin offering today? Something extra in a charity box? That's a great question. I mean, it's basically prayer, right? And it's study and prayer and tzedakah. I like that it's tzedakah also, right? I mean, really what we bring as a sin offering is what we say on Yom Kippur, right? It's teshuvah, that we're making an atonement. It's tzedakah, that we're giving to charity. And it's tefillah, that it's prayer. Now, those three all require Torah study too. So that we know what we did wrong and why we did it wrong, so that we understand why we're praying and what we're trying to accomplish in prayer. but it also it requires opening the heart. You know, if we're not in a relationship with God, then it's going to be very hard for any of this to mean anything. You know, if it's just fulfilling obligations because it's by rote, okay, we're not going to get that far. But if we feel like, you know, God, thank you. Thank you for limiting my choices. Thank you for giving me obligations to fulfill. I remember, you know, Nina and the kids and I were once on spending Shabbos in Palm Springs in a hotel. And we brought a bunch of food with us that we had cooked here, and then a hot plate, and we heated it up before Shabbos and then kept it hot on Shabbos. And we ate in our room, you know, we didn't use the restaurant of the hotel. And then all during that Shabbos, it's like, you know, so we have limitations that other people in that hotel don't have, right? They don't have to worry about it. They're not obligated in Shabbos. That's not their problem. It's our problem. So what does that mean? We can't take the elevator, so now we got to use the stairs. We can't use the card key in our hotel room door, so now we use the do not disturb sign, sort of wedge it in there secretly so that we can push the door open and we don't have to use the card key. We don't want to set off the motion doors, you know, those motion detectors that open doors. So we kind of like go around that area. And a bunch of little things like that. And you could think, oh man, you know, what a bummer. You know, we're Jewish and we have all these restrictions. Or, hey, we're playing this game. You know, we have a game that other people don't have to play, but we get to play it. And we're trying to keep Shabbos even in difficult conditions, so it keeps us mindful all through Shabbos, right? And it's not that Shabbos is something we have to do and it's a bummer. Shabbos is something we get to do, and it's this wonderful gift that requires mindfulness and, you know, being involved in this whole set of rules that other people aren't involved in. And it's a blessing. But it's all in sort of the attitude that you bring to it. Anyway, Joe, to answer your question, I like that when you feel like you've done something wrong, that in addition, you know, to figure out how you're going to stay right and asking God for help, and a little extra in the tzedakah box, great idea, because it doesn't matter what your motivation is for giving to the needy, it's good. It is always good to give more tzedakah, and for sure it strengthens our prayers and our learning. That's what I've got for us today. Sending you all a big hug from the West Coast, a big virtual hug from the West Coast. Take care, my holy brothers and sisters.